The morning sun painted golden streaks across the historic walls of Buckingham Palace. Inside the private chambers, Catherine stood before an ornate mirror, while her team of stylists worked with careful precision. Her hands trembled slightly as she watched them adjust the delicate fabric of her ceremonial gown. This was not just another royal engagement. This was the moment that would define their future, and the future of the monarchy itself. William paced in the adjacent room, his military uniform already perfectly pressed and ready. He kept glancing at his watch, then at the window where crowds had already begun gathering despite the early hour. His father had prepared him for this moment his entire life, yet nothing could truly prepare someone for the weight of a crown. He thought about his mother, Diana, and wished she could be there to see this day. A gentle knock on the door brought him back to the present moment. Catherine's mother, Carol, entered the room with tears already forming in her eyes. She had watched her daughter transform from a university student into a beloved princess, and now into a future queen. The two women embraced carefully, mindful of the elaborate hairstyle that had taken hours to perfect. Carol whispered words of encouragement that only a mother could provide. She reminded Catherine of her strength, her grace, and how the entire nation had fallen in love with her authenticity over the years. The children had been brought in earlier for a private family moment. Prince George, now older and more aware of his destiny, stood tall in his formal attire. Princess Charlotte adjusted her dress nervously, while young Prince Louis asked innocent questions about why everyone seemed so serious. William knelt down to their level, explaining in simple terms what this day meant for their family. He told them about duty, service, and love for their country. The children listened with wide eyes, sensing the importance even if they could not fully comprehend it. Security personnel moved through the palace with military precision. Every route had been checked and rechecked. Intelligence reports had been reviewed countless times. The world would be watching and nothing could go wrong. Outside, the streets of London had transformed into a sea of red, white, and blue. Flags hung from every building, and people from all corners of the globe had traveled to witness this historic moment. Some had camped overnight to secure the best viewing positions. Catherine took a final look at herself in the mirror. The gown was a masterpiece of British craftsmanship, embodying centuries of tradition while incorporating modern elegance. Every stitch told a story. Every jewel held meaning. The tiara that would soon rest upon her head had been worn by queens before her, connecting her to an unbroken chain of history. She thought about the responsibility she was about to accept, not just for herself, but for her children and generations yet to come. William joined her in the preparation room. For a moment they stood together in silence, just looking at each other. Words seemed inadequate for what they both felt. He reached for her hand and she squeezed it tightly. They had walked this path together for so many years, supporting each other through triumphs and challenges. This was their moment, but it was also bigger than both of them. It belonged to history, to the nation, to everyone who believed in what the monarchy represented. The palace staff worked with quiet efficiency, ensuring every detail was perfect. Flowers had been arranged with symbolic meaning. Music had been rehearsed to perfection. The ceremonial coaches stood ready, their horses groomed to magnificence. Everything had been planned down to the second, yet everyone knew that the true magic would come from the unrehearsed moments, the genuine emotions that no script could capture. Catherine's stylist made one final adjustment to the train of her gown. It stretched behind her like a river of silk and embroidery, each flower and symbol representing different parts of the Commonwealth. Artisans had worked for months to create this single garment, pouring their skill and devotion into every detail. Catherine felt the weight of it, both literally and metaphorically. This dress would be photographed, studied, and remembered for centuries. The Archbishop had arrived hours earlier for final preparations. He reviewed the ancient texts one more time, ensuring every word would be spoken with proper gravity and meaning. This ceremony had been performed for over 1,000 years, with each generation adding its own chapter to the story. He felt the honor and the burden of his role, knowing that his words would echo through history. William checked his reflection one last time. The uniform represented his years of military service, his commitment to duty, and his connection to the armed forces who served the nation. Every medal told a story of service and sacrifice. He thought about the promises he was about to make, the oaths that would bind him for the rest of his life. There would be no turning back after today. The weight of responsibility would only grow heavier with time. Catherine's siblings had gathered in a nearby room, offering support and love. They remembered the young woman who had once been so ordinary, so much like them. Now she stood on the threshold of becoming one of the most recognizable women in the world. They felt pride mixed with a touch of sadness, knowing that this day would change everything. The sister they knew would always be with them, but she would also belong to history. The clock ticked steadily toward the appointed hour. Staff members whispered final instructions and confirmations. The media had set up their equipment at designated positions, ready to broadcast this moment to billions of people around the world. Commentators prepared their notes, ready to explain every gesture, every symbol, every tradition to audiences who might be watching their first coronation. Catherine took slow, deep breaths, centering herself. She had trained for public appearances, learned protocols, and studied history. But this was different. This was the culmination of everything she had worked toward since the day she had fallen in love with a prince who would be king. She thought about the little girl she had once been, never imagining such a destiny. Life had taken unexpected turns, and now here she stood, ready to make history. William returned to her side one more time before they would begin their journey to the ceremony. He looked into her eyes and saw his partner, his love, his strength. Together they had built a modern royal family that honored tradition while embracing change. They had shown vulnerability when appropriate and strength when necessary. The nation had watched them grow, stumble, and rise again. Today, that nation would crown them as their future. The moment had arrived. Staff members opened the doors. The sound of the waiting crowds filtered in from the distance. Catherine straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and prepared to step into her destiny. William offered his arm, and she took it with confidence. Whatever happened next, they would face it together, just as they always had. The journey from the palace to Westminster Abbey was about to begin, and the world held its breath in anticipation. The Golden State Coach emerged from the palace gates into a world transformed by celebration and emotion. Catherine sat beside William, her posture perfect despite the nerves fluttering in her stomach. The moment the public caught their first glimpse of the future king and queen, a roar erupted that seemed to shake the very streets of London. People pressed against the barriers, waving flags with such enthusiasm that security personnel had to maintain firm control. The coach moved slowly, deliberately, allowing everyone a chance to witness this historic moment. Catherine looked out at the faces lining the streets. She saw elderly women weeping openly, their hands pressed to their hearts. She saw young children perched on their parents' shoulders, waving miniature flags with innocent joy. She saw veterans standing at attention in their medals, paying respect to the continuation of the institution they had served. Each face told a story, and each story was now woven into this moment. William noticed a group of schoolchildren who had clearly been waiting for hours. Their handmade signs proclaimed messages of love and support. One sign caught his eye, drawn in crayon by a child who could not have been more than 6 years old. It simply said, "Thank you for being kind." Such simple words, yet they captured something essential about what the public wanted from their monarchy. Not perfection, but humanity. Not distance, but connection. The streets had been cleaned until they gleamed. Every building along the route had been decorated with careful attention to detail. Shopkeepers had closed their businesses for the day, standing outside with their families to witness history. Tourists who had planned their trips months in advance stood alongside lifelong Londoners who had seen royal processions before but never one quite like this. This was different. This felt like the beginning of a new chapter. Catherine caught sight of a woman in the crowd who reminded her of her grandmother. The elderly lady wore a vintage dress and hat, clearly from another era, and held a small photograph. As the coach passed, Catherine could see it was a picture of the woman as a young girl at Queen Elizabeth's coronation decades earlier. The connection between past and present, between generations, struck Catherine deeply. She was now part of that continuum, that unbroken chain of history. The horses pulling the coach moved with trained precision, their hooves creating a rhythmic sound against the pavement. The coachmen wore historic uniforms that had been preserved and maintained for centuries. Every detail of this procession, had been choreographed to honor tradition while creating a moment of genuine connection with the modern world. Television cameras mounted on buildings captured every angle, broadcasting the scene to countries where people had woken before dawn to watch. William squeezed Catherine's hand gently, a private gesture in a very public moment. They exchanged a look that communicated volumes without words. They were in this together, partners facing an extraordinary destiny. The weight of the crown was not his alone to bear. They would share it, just as they had shared everything else in their journey. This partnership, this visible love and support, was what made them different from royal couples of the past. A group of nurses in uniform stood together, holding a banner from their hospital. Catherine had visited their facility months earlier, spending time with patients and staff. Seeing them now, she felt a surge of emotion. These were real people, doing difficult work every day, who had taken time to come and show their support. The monarchy meant something to them, represented something beyond ceremony and tradition. It represented stability, continuity, and shared national identity. The route took them past landmarks steeped in centuries of British history. They passed buildings where Parliament had debated the future of the nation. They passed monuments to leaders and heroes who had shaped the country's destiny. Catherine reflected on how she, a commoner by birth, was now becoming part of that legacy. Her children would be in history books. Her choices would be analyzed by scholars for generations. The magnitude of it was almost overwhelming. Young people lined the streets, many holding smartphones to capture their own piece of history. This generation had grown up watching William and Catherine's relationship unfold. They had seen the fairy tale, wedding celebrated the birth of the royal children, and watched this couple navigate the challenges of modern royal life. For many young people, William and Catherine represented a monarchy that could be relevant, that could speak to contemporary values, while honoring ancient traditions. The sun broke through the clouds at just the right moment, sending beams of light down onto the golden coach. It seemed almost theatrical, too perfect to be coincidental. Religious observers in the crowd took it as a sign of blessing. Photographers scrambled to capture the image. Catherine noticed the light and felt a moment of profound gratitude. Whatever higher power guided the universe, she felt watched over, protected, blessed in this moment. Street performers who had been strategically positioned along the route added to the festive atmosphere. Musicians played patriotic songs. Dancers, in traditional costumes, performed with joy and precision. The celebration was not just about witnessing a ceremony. It was about participating in a national moment of unity and pride. In a world often divided by politics and controversy, this was a day when people came together simply to celebrate something beautiful and historic. Catherine noticed international visitors in the crowd, their flags and clothing identifying them as coming from Commonwealth nations and beyond. She saw the flag of Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and dozens of other countries. The British monarchy's reach extended far beyond these London streets, touching lives across the globe. She thought about the responsibility that came with that influence, the careful balance required to honor different cultures, while maintaining the core identity of the institution. A contingent of armed forces personnel stood in formation at key points along the route. They saluted crisply as the coach passed, their discipline and dedication evident in every movement. William, with his own military background, felt a special connection to these men and women. They represented sacrifice, duty, and service to something greater than oneself. These were values he hoped to embody as king. The crowds grew even denser as they approached Westminster Abbey. People had claimed their spots in this area days earlier, determined to be as close as possible to the historic venue. The noise was deafening now, a wall of sound composed of cheers, music, bells, and the collective energy of thousands upon thousands of people. Catherine could feel it vibrating through her body, this tangible expression of public emotion and expectation. An unexpected moment occurred when a small child somehow slipped past the barriers. Security moved instantly, but the child was simply trying to hand a flower to Catherine. William signaled for the coach to pause briefly. Catherine leaned down, accepted the flower with a warm smile, and said something that made the child beam with joy. The crowd erupted in applause. In that unscripted moment, Catherine had shown exactly the kind of queen she intended to be: accessible, warm, genuinely caring. The towers of Westminster Abbey came into view, and Catherine's heart began to race. This was it. The journey through the streets was ending, but the most important part of the day was about to begin. Inside that ancient building, she would kneel, receive the crown, and emerge transformed. She would no longer be simply Catherine, the woman who had captured a prince's heart. She would be Queen Catherine, a title that carried the weight of history and the hope of the future. William looked at the abbey and thought of all the monarchs who had been crowned there before him. He thought of the oaths he would swear, the promises he would make not just to his nation but to God. His faith had always been private, personal, but today it would be public, witnessed by billions. He felt ready, more than ready. He felt called to this moment, prepared by every experience of his life for what was about to happen. The coach slowed to its final stop. Palace officials stood ready to assist. The crowds pressed even closer, everyone straining for a final glimpse before the couple entered the abbey. Catherine took one last look at the sea of faces, the ocean, of flags, the manifestation of public support and anticipation. Then she turned toward the ancient doors that would open to receive them, ready to step into history. The massive doors of Westminster Abbey swung open, revealing an interior that took Catherine's breath away despite having seen it during rehearsals. The reality of this moment, with every seat filled with dignitaries from around the world, transformed the familiar space into something almost otherworldly. Sunlight streamed through the ancient stained glass windows, creating patterns of colored light that danced across the stone floors. The air itself seemed heavy with history and reverence. William stepped out first, then turned to assist Catherine. As her foot touched the threshold of the abbey, a choir of voices rose in a harmony so pure and powerful that several people in the congregation openly wept. The music had been chosen to represent both tradition and the modern era, blending centuries-old hymns with contemporary compositions. Catherine felt the vibrations of the organ in her chest, a physical manifestation of the spiritual significance of this place. Their children followed behind, walking with remarkable composure for their young ages. George understood the solemnity of the occasion, his face serious but not frightened. Charlotte kept glancing at her mother, drawing strength from Catherine's calm presence. Louis held his sister's hand, his eyes wide with wonder at the grandeur surrounding them. The sight of the royal children processing into the abbey touched hearts worldwide. They represented continuity, the future of the monarchy walking quite literally behind their parents. The congregation rose as one, the rustling of formal attire creating a whisper that echoed through the ancient stones. Catherine recognized faces from around the world. There were heads of state, religious leaders, representatives from charities she had supported, and people who had touched her life in meaningful ways. Each person present had been carefully chosen, their invitation representing some aspect of the nation's life or the couple's personal journey. The aisle stretched before them, impossibly long yet all too short. Each step Catherine took felt weighted with meaning. She passed tombs of kings and queens who had lived centuries before, their stone effigies watching silently as another chapter of royal history unfolded. She thought about the women who had walked this same path, feeling the same mixture of honor and responsibility. She was joining their ranks, becoming part of an exclusive sisterhood of queens that spanned a millennium. William maintained his steady pace, but Catherine could see the emotion in the set of his shoulders, the slight tension in his jaw. This building held profound meaning for him. His mother's funeral had been held here, one of the darkest days of his life. Now he returned in triumph, carrying forward the legacy she had left behind. Diana's spirit seemed to hover in the air, blessing this union of her son with his beloved, approving of the modern monarchy they were creating together. The archbishop stood waiting at the altar, his vestments gleaming with gold thread and precious jewels. His face was serene but serious, fully aware of the sacred duty he was about to perform. Behind him, the high altar was adorned with flowers chosen for their symbolic meaning. White roses for purity, red for courage, blue for royalty. The scent of the blooms mingled with the incense, creating an aroma that was at once ancient and immediate. As they reached their designated positions, Catherine and William turned briefly to face the congregation. Every seat was filled. Television cameras discreetly positioned captured every angle. Outside, massive screens allowed the crowds to watch, while around the world, families gathered in their homes, offices paused their work, and strangers stood together in public squares to witness this moment. The global audience was estimated in the billions, a number almost impossible to comprehend. The Archbishop began to speak, his voice resonant and clear. The ancient words of the coronation service had been spoken countless times before, yet they felt fresh and urgent in this moment. He spoke of duty and service, of faith and humility, of the sacred trust between monarch and people. Catherine listened to every word, committing them to memory, letting them sink deep into her consciousness. These were the principles that would guide her reign. The first hymn began and the entire abbey sang together. The sound was overwhelming, powerful, a collective voice raised in celebration and prayer. Catherine sang along, her voice joining thousands of others, from the humblest choir member to the most powerful world leader. In that moment of shared song, all distinctions of rank and privilege seemed to dissolve. They were simply humans, gathered together to mark a significant moment in their collective story. William was called forward first for his portion of the ceremony. Catherine watched as her husband, her partner, her love, prepared to accept the weight of kingship. She saw the boy who had lost his mother too young. She saw the man who had struggled to find his path. She saw the father who played with his children and the humanitarian who genuinely cared about making the world better. All of these versions of William were present, all contributing to the king he was about to become. The crown was brought forward on a velvet cushion, its jewels catching the light and throwing rainbow patterns across the ancient stones. This physical object represented abstract concepts: authority, duty, the nation itself. William knelt, and in that act of kneeling, showed the humility that would define his reign. A king who understood that his power came not from the crown, but from the people who accepted his right to wear it. Catherine felt tears building, but refused to let them fall. She needed to be strong, to project the dignity and grace expected of a queen, but inside her heart swelled with pride and love for the man who was being crowned before her eyes. She thought of their university days, of falling in love with someone who happened to be a prince. She had chosen this path knowing its challenges, and she would walk it with her head held high. The Archbishop's hands lowered the crown onto William's head, and at that precise moment, a profound silence fell over the abbey. It lasted only seconds, but in that silence, everyone present felt the weight of what had just occurred. A new king had been made. The continuity of the monarchy, stretching back over 1,000 years, had been renewed for another generation. Then, as if released from a spell, the abbey erupted in proclamations and cheers. Now it was Catherine's turn. She stepped forward, her legs steady despite the emotion coursing through her. The train of her gown flowed behind her like a river of silk. Attendants adjusted it carefully as she moved, ensuring every fold lay perfectly. She reached the designated spot and slowly, gracefully lowered herself to kneel. The stone was hard beneath her knees, but she barely felt it. Her entire being was focused on this moment. The Archbishop addressed her directly, speaking words that had been slightly modified for the modern era, but retained their essential meaning. He asked if she was willing to take on the responsibility of queenship, to serve her nation with dedication and grace, to uphold the values of faith and duty that the monarchy represented. Catherine's voice rang out clear and strong as she affirmed her commitment. She was not just accepting a title, she was making vows as serious and binding as wedding vows. The queen consort's crown was brought forward. This crown had its own history, having been worn by queens before her who had stood beside their king husbands. Catherine had studied its symbolism, understanding that while it was smaller and less ornate than the king's crown, it was no less significant. It represented partnership, the recognition that monarchy was not a solo endeavor but a shared responsibility. As the crown was lowered onto her head, Catherine felt its weight both physically and metaphorically. This was real. She was now Queen Catherine, consort to King William. The little girl from Berkshire who had once dreamed ordinary dreams had been transformed into royalty. Yet she was still herself, still the woman who valued family, duty, and genuine human connection. The crown did not change who she was. It amplified her ability to serve. The congregation watched in hushed reverence as the newly crowned king and queen stood together. William reached for Catherine's hand, a gesture not in the official program but one that felt necessary. They faced the people together, crowned and committed, ready to lead their nation into the future. The sight of them standing there, clearly in love, clearly united in purpose, moved many to tears. The choir launched into another hymn, this one triumphant and joyful. The music seemed to lift the very roof of the abbey, soaring up toward heaven itself. Catherine felt lighter suddenly, as if the completion of the ceremony had released some tension she had been holding. The hardest part was over. They had been crowned. What came next was the work of actually being king and queen. But in this moment, they could simply stand together and absorb the magnitude of what had just happened. Religious leaders from various faiths came forward to offer blessings, reflecting the multicultural nature of modern Britain. Each blessing added another layer of meaning to the ceremony, acknowledging that the monarchy served people of all beliefs and backgrounds. Catherine appreciated this inclusivity, feeling that it represented the kind of reign they wanted to have, traditional in its core values but open and welcoming to all. The final prayers were spoken, asking for divine guidance and wisdom for the newly crowned monarchs. The archbishop raised his hands in benediction, and once again a profound silence fell over the abbey. In that silence, thousands of people silently. The newly crowned King William and Queen Catherine turned to face the congregation as husband and wife, as partners, but now also as monarch and consort. The transformation was visible in their bearing. They seemed to stand taller, their shoulders squared with newfound authority. Yet their eyes still held the warmth and humanity that had endeared them to millions. The crown had not changed them. It had revealed who they had been becoming all along. The procession out of Westminster Abbey began with a majesty that somehow exceeded even the entrance. Now they were not approaching their destiny but embodying it. Each step carried the weight of the crowns upon their heads. The jewels caught the light with every movement, sending sparkles across the ancient stones. Behind them, the royal family followed in strict order of precedence, creating a living tableau of the monarchy's continuity across generations. George walked with his grandfather's steady confidence, though he was still just a boy. He understood, perhaps better than anyone realized, what his parents had just accepted. One day this would be his path too. The crown his father wore would eventually rest on his own head. But for now he was simply a son, proud of his parents, awed by the ceremony, and trying his best to meet the expectations placed upon him. The congregation remained standing, many with hands pressed to hearts as the royal procession passed. Tears streamed down faces without shame or embarrassment. A British diplomat who had served for 40 years openly wept, later explaining that he had never expected to witness something so moving. A young intern from a Commonwealth nation felt her connection to the British monarchy deepen in ways she had not anticipated. The ceremony had touched something primal and profound in everyone present. As Catherine passed, women in the congregation saw themselves reflected in her journey. She had not been born to royalty. She had worked regular jobs, lived a relatively normal life, and then found herself thrust into the most extraordinary circumstances imaginable. Her grace under pressure, her dedication to duty while maintaining her sense of self, had made her a role model for millions. Now crowned as queen, she represented possibility and transformation. The massive doors opened again, and the sound from outside rushed in like a physical force. The crowds had been watching on screens, and the moment the coronation was complete, their cheers had reached a fever pitch. The roar was deafening, almost primal in its intensity. It was the sound of a nation celebrating, of people who had waited hours in the cold just to be part of this moment. It was the sound of history being made and witnessed. William and Catherine paused at the threshold, taking in the scene before them. The streets were a sea of humanity, flags waving, arms raised, faces turned toward them with expressions of joy and celebration. For a brief moment, they were simply William and Catherine again, two people overwhelmed by the scale of public emotion directed at them. Then they stepped forward, and the crowd's response intensified even further. The coronation carriage was even more elaborate than the one that had brought them. The gold state coach, used only for the most significant royal occasions, gleamed in the sunlight. Its gilded surfaces were covered in intricate carvings depicting historical and mythological scenes. The interior was plush red velvet, and the whole contraption was so heavy it required 8 horses to pull it. It was a moving piece of history, and now William and Catherine would ride in it as king and queen. Assistance was offered, but Catherine managed to enter the carriage with remarkable grace despite the weight of her crown and the bulk of her ceremonial gown. William followed, settling beside her. Through the windows they could see the faces of people pressed as close as security would allow. The expressions were varied: joy, tears, pride, excitement, wonder. Each face told a story of why this moment mattered to them personally. The carriage began its slow journey back to Buckingham Palace. The route was longer this time, designed to allow more people a chance to see the newly crowned monarchs. The crowds along this extended route had been waiting even longer, their anticipation building with each passing hour. When the golden carriage finally came into view, the noise reached levels that bordered on painful. People screamed, cheered, sang, and cried with abandon. Catherine found herself deeply moved by the public response. She had expected celebration, but this felt different. This felt like genuine love and acceptance. The British people, often reserved and cynical, had opened their hearts completely in this moment. She saw elderly women who remembered previous coronations, their faces alight with nostalgia and hope. She saw young people capturing the moment on their phones, already sharing it with the world. She saw families, couples, individuals all united in this shared experience. William waved to the crowds, his gesture acknowledging their presence and their importance to this day. Without the people, a coronation was just ceremony. With them, it became something transcendent. He understood, perhaps more clearly than ever before, that his role was not to rule over these people, but to serve them. The crown he wore was not a symbol of his power over them, but of his commitment to them. A group of veterans saluted as the carriage passed. William returned the salute with military precision, honoring their service. These men and women had defended the nation, had sacrificed years of their lives to duty. He felt a kinship with them, understanding that kingship, like military service, was about putting something greater than yourself first. It was about being willing to sacrifice personal freedom for the good of others. Children in the crowd held up drawings they had made of William and Catherine. Some were remarkably detailed, others were charmingly abstract, but all showed the love and excitement these young people felt. Catherine made a mental note to try to collect some of these drawings later, to preserve these artifacts of public sentiment. She wanted her own children to see how the nation had celebrated their parents' coronation. The carriage passed through areas of London that represented the city's diversity. In one neighborhood, the crowds were predominantly South Asian, their enthusiasm no less fervent. In another, African and Caribbean communities celebrated with music and dance. The British monarchy in the 21st century served an incredibly diverse population, and William and Catherine were determined to be monarchs for everyone, regardless of background or belief. Street performers continued to entertain the waiting crowds between the arrival of different parts of the procession. Jugglers, musicians, and dancers kept spirits high. But whenever the main carriage came into view, all other activity stopped. Every eye turned to the golden coach and the crowned figures visible through its windows. The performers themselves often stopped mid-performance, unable to resist watching history pass by. The journey provided Catherine time to reflect on the day so far. The ceremony had been more emotional than she had expected. Feeling the weight of the crown lowered onto her head, hearing the proclamations, seeing William crowned beside her, it had all combined to create an experience beyond anything rehearsals had prepared her for. She felt changed, marked by this experience in ways she was only beginning to understand. William noticed small details as they traveled. He saw a man holding a photograph of his grandmother, the late Queen Elizabeth. He saw another person with a picture of his mother, Diana. These people were connecting this moment to their own memories of royal history, weaving today into a larger narrative that spanned their lifetimes. The monarchy was not just about the current occupants of the throne. It was about continuity and connection across generations. The carriage turned a corner, and Buckingham Palace came into view in the distance. The sight of it sent a thrill through Catherine. They were almost home. Soon they would stand on the famous balcony and greet the crowds in that iconic setting. But for now, they continued their journey through the streets, continuing to connect with the people who had made this day possible through their support and enthusiasm. An unexpected moment occurred when the carriage passed a care home whose residents had been brought outside to watch. These elderly people, some in wheelchairs, some with nurses attending them, waved with as much vigor as their strength allowed. William asked the carriage to slow even more, giving these people who might not have many more chances to witness royal history a longer moment to take it all in. The gesture was noticed and appreciated, adding to the growing narrative of a king who truly cared. The sunlight continued to bless the day, casting everything in golden light that made the scene seem almost magical. Photographers scrambled to capture the perfect image, knowing these pictures would be printed in history books and displayed in museums for centuries to come. Every angle was considered significant, every moment potentially iconic. The pressure to document this day perfectly was immense. Catherine thought about the evening ahead. There would be formal dinners, official photographs, and countless other obligations. But there would also be quiet moments with William and their children, processing everything that had happened. She looked forward to those private moments as much as any public celebration. The crown might be public, but their family remained their own, a source of strength and normalcy in their extraordinary lives. The crowd seemed to grow even larger as they approached Buckingham Palace. People had converged from all over. The gates of Buckingham Palace closed behind the golden carriage, providing a momentary buffer between the public spectacle and the private reality of what had just occurred. Palace staff stood ready, having watched the entire ceremony on screens throughout the building. Many had tears in their eyes. They had served William and Catherine for years, watching them grow into their roles and now witnessed their ultimate elevation to king and queen. The pride was personal and professional. Catherine felt the tension ease slightly as they entered the palace courtyard. The crowds were still audible, a constant roar of celebration from beyond the walls, but here there was a moment of relative calm. William helped her from the carriage, and for just a second they stood together in the courtyard, looking at each other with expressions that communicated everything words could not. They had done it. They were crowned. The weight of it was real and immediate. The children were brought to them quickly. George, Charlotte, and Louis needed reassurance that their parents were still their parents. Despite the crowns and the ceremony, Catherine knelt down, careful of her gown, and embraced all three. They peppered her with questions and observations, their young voices cutting through the solemnity with blessed normalcy. William joined the embrace, creating a family circle that centered them all amid the extraordinary circumstances. Palace officials reminded them that the crowds were waiting for the balcony appearance. Traditional protocol called for specific family members to join them, and arrangements were being finalized. But William and Catherine had already decided they wanted this moment to reflect their vision of a modern, streamlined monarchy. It would be themselves, their children, and only the most senior working royals. This was about the future, not just honoring the past. The walk through the palace corridors to the balcony room seemed longer than Catherine remembered from rehearsals. Her crown felt heavier with each step, or perhaps she was simply more aware of it now. Staff members they passed stopped what they were doing to offer congratulations and blessings. Their genuine warmth was touching, reminding Catherine that the palace staff were not just employees, but people who had invested emotionally in this family's success. The room behind the famous balcony was filled with nervous energy. Other family members who would appear on the balcony were already gathering, adjusting their formal wear, checking their appearance one final time. Everyone understood the significance of this moment. The balcony appearance was in many ways the culmination of the entire day. It was the moment when the newly crowned monarchs would present themselves to their people in the most public and symbolic way possible. Catherine could hear the crowd beyond the glass doors that led to the balcony. The sound was incredible, a living thing that seemed to have its own heartbeat. She peeked through the curtain and saw the mall stretched before them, packed with humanity as far as the eye could see. Union Jack flags created a sea of red, white, and blue. People had climbed trees, perched on lampposts, and found every possible vantage point. The scale of it was almost incomprehensible. William stood beside her, also looking out at the assembled masses. He thought about previous balcony appearances he had experienced, from childhood moments with his grandmother to his wedding day with Catherine. This was different. This time he would stand there as king with his queen beside him. The responsibility felt enormous, but looking at the crowds, he also felt inspired. These people believed in the monarchy, believed in what it represented. He could not let them down. The children were given final instructions about how to behave on the balcony. George took it seriously, nodding at each point. Charlotte promised to hold Louis's hand. Louis, youngest and most unpredictable, simply looked excited about the whole adventure. Their presence on the balcony was important to William and Catherine. They wanted the public to see the family unit, to understand that the monarchy was not just about individuals, but about generations and continuity. The moment arrived. Palace officials opened the doors and the sound of the crowd rushed in like a tidal wave. William stepped out first and the roar intensified to levels that seemed impossible. He raised his hand in acknowledgement, a gesture that sent another wave of cheers rolling across the assembled thousands. Then Catherine appeared beside him, and if possible, the crowd's response grew even louder. She smiled, that genuine warm smile that had made her beloved, and waved to the people who had supported her journey. The children followed, and the sight of them brought a collective gasp of delight from the crowd. George stood between his parents, looking remarkably composed for his age. Charlotte and Louis flanked them, waving with the unself-conscious enthusiasm of childhood. The image was perfect. A young family, crowned but approachable, traditional but modern. Cameras captured the moment from every angle, knowing these images would define how the coronation was remembered. Catherine looked out at the faces she could see in the front of the crowd. She saw tears, smiles, expressions of pure joy. She saw people recording the moment on phones, others simply taking it in with their own eyes, wanting the memory to be personal rather than digital. She saw generations, grandparents who had lived through previous reigns, parents hoping to give their children a memory to treasure, young people experiencing their first major royal event. William thought about his grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, who had stood on this balcony so many times during her long reign. She had set an example of dedicated service that he could only hope to emulate. She had guided him, prepared him, and trusted him to carry forward the legacy she had protected and strengthened. He felt her presence in this moment, as if she were standing beside him, approving and blessing what she saw. The Royal Air Force flypast was approaching, a traditional element of major royal celebrations. Catherine could hear the distant sound of aircraft engines. The crowd's attention turned skyward in anticipation. George pulled on his father's sleeve, pointing excitedly at the sky. William nodded, sharing his son's excitement while maintaining the dignity expected of a king. The balance between being a father and being a monarch was something he was still learning to navigate. The aircraft appeared, flying in perfect formation. Red, white, and blue smoke trailed behind them, painting the British flag across the sky. The sight was spectacular, patriotic without being aggressive, celebratory while honoring military tradition. The crowd cheered anew, watching the planes pass over Buckingham Palace in a salute to the newly crowned monarchs. Catherine felt goosebumps rise on her arms despite the warmth of the day. Louis could not contain his excitement, bouncing slightly and pointing at the planes. Charlotte whispered to him, trying to remind him of proper behavior, but even she was caught up in the spectacle. William and Catherine exchanged a glance, both thinking the same thing. Let the children be children. The public did not want to see perfectly rehearsed robots. They wanted to see a real family experiencing a genuine moment. As the last plane disappeared from view, William and Catherine waved once more to the crowds. The moment had been perfect, capturing exactly what they had hoped to convey. Continuity with the past, hope for the future, and a monarchy that remained relevant and connected to the people it served. The balcony appearance had been brief, but it would be replayed and analyzed for days, weeks, years to come. They returned inside, and immediately the more relaxed atmosphere of family took over. The children began talking over each other, describing what they had seen and felt. Catherine removed her crown carefully, feeling instant relief at the lessening of physical weight, though the metaphorical weight remained. William did the same, and for a moment they were just parents again, listening to their excited children process an extraordinary experience. Staff brought refreshments, understanding that the royal family had been standing, walking, and performing for hours with little chance to rest or eat. Catherine gratefully accepted water, suddenly aware of how thirsty she was. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the ceremony was beginning to fade, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion that she knew would only fully hit her later. But there was no time to rest yet. The day's schedule included a formal luncheon with visiting heads of state, official photographs that would take hours to complete, and numerous other obligations. Being king and queen was not just about crowns and ceremonies. It was about endless duty, constant performance, perpetual responsibility. Catherine straightened her shoulders, preparing to continue. William caught her eye and smiled. A private smile meant only for her. In that smile was acknowledgement of what they had accomplished together, gratitude for her partnership and promise of continued support. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The crown might rest on his head, but they wore its weight together, partners in every sense of the word. The luncheon was being prepared in the state dining room, where world leaders and dignitaries waited to congratulate the newly crowned king and queen. Catherine knew the conversations would be diplomatic, carefully navigating the complex relationships between nations. She had been trained for this, had attended countless formal dinners, but it felt different now. She was no longer a princess learning the ropes. She was queen, expected to hold her own in discussions of internatio. Evening descended on London with a gentle grace, the sky painted in shades of pink and gold that seemed fitting for such a historic day. The crowds outside Buckingham Palace had not diminished despite the passing hours. If anything, they seemed to have grown, as people who had watched from home or from other locations made their way to the palace, wanting to be part of the celebration, even if just standing outside its gates. The party atmosphere continued with spontaneous singing, dancing, and conversations between strangers who felt united by the shared experience. Inside the palace, Catherine finally had a moment to herself. She had changed out of the ceremonial gown, though the relief of removing its weight was tempered by a strange sense of loss. That dress would go into history, preserved in archives and eventually displayed in exhibitions. People would study its every detail, write papers about its symbolism. But for Catherine, it had been simply the gown she wore on the most important day of her life. She gently touched the fabric one last time before it was carefully taken away by archivists. William found her in one of the private drawing rooms, staring out at the illuminated palace grounds. He had also changed into more comfortable formal wear, though still appropriately regal. He carried 2 glasses of champagne and handed one to Catherine without a word. They stood together at the window, sipping the champagne and watching the celebrations continue outside. The sounds of joy were muted by the thick palace walls but still audible, a constant reminder that this day was bigger than just them. Catherine thought about everyone who had been part of their journey to this moment. Her parents, who had supported her through the intense scrutiny that came with dating and then marrying a prince. Her siblings, who had kept her grounded and reminded her of who she was beyond the titles. Friends from university who had known her before the fairy tale began, teachers who had shaped her thinking. All of these people had contributed to making her the woman capable of standing beside a king. William reflected on his own path. The loss of his mother at such a young age had shaped him in profound ways. For years he had struggled with the public role expected of him, feeling the weight of his title without fully understanding its purpose. Meeting Catherine had changed everything. She had given him a reason to embrace his destiny rather than resist it. She had shown him that duty and happiness were not mutually exclusive, that he could honor his position while remaining true to himself. The children had been put to bed an hour earlier, though George had protested that he was too excited to sleep. Charlotte had fallen asleep almost immediately, exhausted by the long day. Louis had asked countless questions about when they could do it all again, not quite understanding that coronations were once-in-a-lifetime events. Catherine and William had read them stories, kissed them goodnight, and promised to answer more questions in the morning. Being parents, even on a day like this, remained their most important role. The official photographs from earlier in the evening were being processed and prepared for release. Catherine had seen a few preliminary images and been struck by how different they looked compared to how she had felt in the moment. In the photos, she appeared serene and confident, every inch a queen. She did not look like someone who had been terrified of tripping over her gown or saying the wrong thing during the ceremony. The camera had captured the role she was playing, not the anxious woman underneath. William had been more comfortable with the photographs, having grown up in front of cameras. But even he admitted that these felt different. Previous photographs had shown him as a prince, a role he had been preparing for his entire life. These new images showed him as king, a role that still felt somewhat unreal despite the crown that had rested on his head. He wondered how long it would take before he stopped being surprised when people addressed him as Your Majesty. A private dinner had been arranged for close family members, those who had stood by them through everything. Catherine's parents were there, her father unusually emotional as he toasted his daughter, the Queen. William's family members spoke of pride and continuity, of honoring the past while embracing the future. The conversation was warm and genuine, free from the diplomatic carefulness required at the formal luncheon. Here they could be themselves. Catherine's mother pulled her aside for a private moment, taking her daughter's hands and simply looking at her with wonder and love. She remembered the little girl who had played in their garden, who had studied hard and played sports and never seemed destined for anything more extraordinary than a good career and happy marriage. Now that little girl wore a queen's crown. The improbability of it all, the sheer unlikeliness of this outcome, made it feel even more precious. As the evening grew later, guests began to depart. Diplomatic protocols were observed, with careful attention to the order in which people took their leave. But beneath the formality, there was genuine warmth. People who had traveled from around the world to witness this coronation departed, feeling they had been part of something significant, something that transcended politics and ceremony, to touch on fundamental human needs for continuity, tradition, and hope. Finally, truly alone except for necessary security, William and Catherine returned to their private apartments. The day had lasted forever and passed in a blink. Catherine sat down heavily, suddenly feeling every minute of standing, walking, and smiling. Her feet ached despite the custom-made shoes. Her scalp was tender where the crown had rested. But more than physical tiredness, she felt emotionally drained by the intensity of the experience. William joined her on the sofa, and they sat in comfortable silence for several minutes. There were no cameras now, no watching eyes, no need to maintain any particular image. They could simply be two people processing an extraordinary day. William eventually spoke, his voice soft and reflective. He talked about feeling his mother's presence during the ceremony, about believing she would have been proud. Catherine squeezed his hand, understanding the complex emotions around Diana's absence from this triumph. They talked about the future, about the reign that stretched ahead of them. There would be challenges, they both knew. The monarchy faced questions about its relevance in the modern world. There were political complexities to navigate, social changes to acknowledge, environmental crises to address. Their role would be largely symbolic, but symbols mattered. How they conducted themselves, what they chose to emphasize, would shape public perception of the monarchy for decades. Catherine expressed her hopes for what kind of queen she could be. She wanted to be accessible while maintaining dignity, modern while respecting tradition, relatable while acknowledging her unique position. She wanted to use her platform to highlight causes that mattered: mental health, childhood development, addiction recovery, the arts. She wanted to be remembered not just for wearing beautiful clothes and attending ceremonies, but for making a genuine difference in people's lives. William shared his vision for his reign. He wanted to be a king who listened more than he spoke, who learned from experts and amplified important voices, rather than dominating every conversation. He wanted to use the monarchy's convening power to bring together people working on solutions to major challenges. He wanted to modernize the institution while preserving what made it special. Above all, he wanted to serve with the same dedication his grandmother had shown, adapted for a new era. They discussed their children and the balance they would need to strike in raising future heirs. George would one day wear the crown, but they wanted him to have as normal a childhood as possible first. Charlotte and Louis would need to find their own paths, supporting the monarchy without being consumed by it. The pressure on royal children was immense, and both William and Catherine were determined to protect their children from the worst of it, while preparing them for the reality they would face. As midnight approached, they walked out onto a private balcony, one not visible to the public. The celebrations in the city continued, though more quietly now. Fireworks had been set off earlier, and the sky still held a faint haze of smoke. London sparkled below them, ancient and modern all at once. A city that had witnessed coronations for over 1,000 years, and would witness more in the centuries to come. Catherine thought about the woman she had been that morning, before the crown. In many ways, she was unchanged. She still loved the same man, cared about the same things, held the same values, but she also felt fundamentally altered by the experience of the coronation. The vows she had made were not just words. They were binding commitments that would shape every decision for the rest of her life. She'd become something greater than herself, and there was both loss and gain in that transformation. William looked at his wife, his queen, his partner in all things, and felt overwhelming gratitude. He could not imagine doing this with anyone else. Other princes had married for duty or alliance, but he had married for love, and that love had only deepened with time. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The crown might rest on his head alone, but its weight was shared. They went inside as the clock struck midnight, officially ending the coronation day. Tomorrow would bring new responsibilities and new challenges. There would be speeches to write, engagements to attend, decisions to make.